Hello everyone. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to make this video. These past few days have been, what's the word I'm looking for? Okay, probably doesn't have a word. My boss is driving me insane, and Ahita is just the most adorable thing that totally gets her way on everything. And therefore, I must admit, I tend to do what she wants me to do instead of what I need to do. But that's okay. She deserves that. Plus, still recovering from the trip from Kentucky. Very well worth it, but very exhausting. And then that leads back to my boss being an idiot and, pissing me off. But this video is going to be about the Salem witch trials. And everybody always has their one thing that no matter what they do, it draws them back to it. And for many, many years, like as far back as I can remember, like 5, 6, 7 years old, the Salem witch trials and all the other witch trials that have happened is my thing. And I know that this is not something that really goes along with this channel, what I've set up for this channel so far, but they are victims, and they too deserve a voice. And, why not? I know that there is a lot of people that subscribe that are interested in stuff like this, and I know that there is a few that probably doesn't interest in any way, but I know that you're still able to see them as a victim. And the reality is, most of the people that was claimed to be witches wasn't even witches. They were actually Christians, or, a different, whatever you call it. I'm still running on puppy brain, so forgive me when I lose my words. Anyway, to start the video, it's the Salem witch trial victims, and who were they? The Salem witch trials took place in Salem, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, between 1692 and 1693. Historians believe the accused witches were victims of mob mentality, mass hysteria, and scapegoating. The Salem witch trials began in January 1692 after a group of girls began behaving strangely, and a local doctor ruled that they were bewitched. The girls then accused a local slave, Tituba, and two other women of bewitching them. When Tituba was arrested a few days later, confessed she was a witch and stated that there were other witches in Salem. The colonists panicked and began a massive witch hunt to find these other witches. Many historians believe that the number of individuals in the colony, particularly the Putnam family, quickly took advantage of this witch hunt and the mass hysteria by accusing rival neighbors of other colonists that they disapproved of or wanted revenge against. Puritans were very hostile towards colonists who didn't follow the strict religious and societal rules in the colony. As a result, it is not surprising that many of the accused witches were outspoken women, Quakers, slaves, colonists with criminal backgrounds and or prior witchcraft accusations, or colonists who criticized the witch trials. According to the book, The Societal History of Crime and Punishment in America, a number of historians have speculated as to why the witch hunts occurred and why certain people were singled out. These proposed reasons have included personal vendettas, fear of strong women, and economic competition. Regardless, the Salem witch trials are a memorial and a warning to what hysteria, religious intolerance, and ignorance can cause in the criminal justice system. All of these factors created a volatile and dangerous situation that resulted in the imprisonment and death of many innocent people. The official death count for the Salem witch trials is 20 people. 19 victims were hanged at Proctor's Ledge near Gallows Hill, and one person was tortured to death. 4 people also died in prison while awaiting trial. The other victims were either found guilty but pardoned, found not guilty, were never indicted, evaded arrest, or escaped from jail. According to various sources, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Not everyone who was accused was pursued by authorities or arrested, though. Between 140 and 150 people were arrested for witchcraft during the witch hunt. Some of the court records have been lost over the years, but the following is an almost complete list of the victims arrested for witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Arthur Abbott, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., John Alden Jr., Abigail Baker, Abigail Barker, Mary Barker, William Barker Sr., William Barker Jr., Sarah Bassett, Sarah Bibber, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Bishop, Mary Black, Mary Bradbury, Mary Bridges Sr., Mary Bridges Jr., Sarah Bridges, Hannah Bromwich, Sarah Buckley, George Burroughs, Candy, Martha Carrier, Richard Carrier, Sarah Carrier, Thomas Carrier Jr., Bethia Carter Sr., Elizabeth Carey, Sarah Churchill, Mary Clark, Rachel Clinton, Sarah Cloyce, Sarah Cole of Lynn, Sarah Cole of Salem, Elizabeth Carlson, Giles Corey, Martha Corey, Deliverance Dane, Mary DeRich, Elizabeth Dicer, Ann Oliver, Lydia Dustin, Sarah Dustin, Danielle Earns, Rebecca Eames, Mary Esty, Esther Elwell, Martha Emerson, Joseph Emmons, Philip English, Thomas Ferrer, Edward Farrington, Abigail Faulkner Sr., Dorothy Faulkner, Elizabeth Fosdick, Anne Foster, Nicholas Frost, Eunice Fry, Dorcas Good, Sarah Good, Mary Green, Margaret Hawks, Sarah Hawks, Dorcas Harr, Abigail Hobbs, Deliverance Hobbs, William Hobbs, Elizabeth Howe, Elizabeth Hubbard, Frances Hutchins, Mary Irison, John Jackson Sr., John Jackson Jr., George Jacobs Sr., George Jacobs Jr., Margaret Jacobs, Rebecca Jacobs, Elizabeth Johnson Sr., Elizabeth Johnson Jr., Rebecca Johnson, Stephen Johnson, Mary Lacey Sr., Mary Lacey Jr., John Lee, Mercy Lewis, Jane Lilly, Mary Marston, Susanna Martin, Sarah Morey, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Osborne, Mary Osgood, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Sarah Peace, Joanne Penny, Hannah Post, Mary Post, Susanna Post, Margaret Prince, Benjamin Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor, Sarah Proctor, William Proctor. Anne Pudiator? Yeah, don't get me to lying on that one. Wilmot Red, Sarah Rice, Susanna Roots, Henry Salter, John Soddy, Margaret Scott, Anne Sears, Susanna Sheldon, Abigail Soames, Martha Sparks, Mary Taylor, Tituba, John Tukey, Mary Toothaker, Roger Toothaker, Joanna Tyler, Martha Tyler, Mercy Wardwell, Samuel Wardwell, Sarah Wardwell, Mary Warren, Sarah Wilds, John Willard, Sarah Wilson Sr., Mary Withridge. Some were found guilty and executed. Bridget Bishop, age 50s. Bridget Bishop was a widow who lived in Salem town. Bishop had a bad reputation around town because she had been accused of witchcraft years before and had frequent run-ins with the law. Bishop wasn't the first person accused during the Salem witch trials, but she was the first person tried because it was believed that the case against her would be easy to win. She was brought to trial on June 2nd, found guilty, and became the first person executed during the witch trials when she was hanged on June 10th, 1692. Sarah Good, age 39. Sarah Good lived in Salem Village and was the wife of William Good. At the time of the witch trials, she was poor and pregnant and would often go door to door in Salem Village begging for handouts while her husband worked as a day laborer. Good was one of the first people accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials, along with Sarah Osborne and Tituba. When the afflicted girls first began showing symptoms that they were bewitched, the girls accused the three women of bewitching them. Sarah Good was brought to trial June 29th and executed July 19th, 1692. Elizabeth Howe, age 57. Elizabeth Howe lived in Topsfield and was the wife of farmer James Howe. Much like Bridget Bishop, Howe had also been accused of witchcraft before. In her previous case, she was accused of bewitching a local girl. No charges were ever brought up against Howe, but she was later refused admittance to an Ipswich church due to the incident. In May of 1692, she was accused of witchcraft by the afflicted girls in Salem Village. She was arrested, brought to trial on June 29th, and executed on July 19th, 1692. Susanna Martin, age 71. Susanna Martin was a poor widow who lived in Amesbury at the time of the Salem witch trials. Much like Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin had also been accused of witchcraft before. In her previous cases, she was accused of infanticide and tormenting people with her specter. The charges were eventually dropped or dismissed. Martin was accused of witchcraft by the afflicted girls in the spring of 1692. Susanna Martin was taken to Salem Village, brought to trial on June 29th, and executed on July 19th, 1692. Rebecca Nurse, age 71. Rebecca Nurse was an elderly grandmother from Salem Village and the wife of farmer Francis Nurse. She was a pious and popular woman who had a long-standing feud with the Putnam family over border boundaries between their adjoining land. She also disapproved of the controversial appointment of Samuel Parris, whom was a close friend of the Putnams, and the new Salem village minister. The Putnams were Rebecca Nurse's main accusers during the witch trials, and many of them testified against her. Rebecca Nurse was originally found not guilty at the end of her trial in late June, But when the verdict was read out loud in the court, the afflicted girls protested, and the jury was asked to reconsider its decision. The jury reconsidered and came back with a guilty verdict. Rebecca Nurse was executed on July 19th, 1692. Sarah Wilds, age 65. Sarah Wilds lived in Topsfield and was the wife of local Judge John Wilds. Sarah Wilds had somewhat of a bad reputation due to previous brushes with law. In 1649, she was accused of fornicating out of wedlock with Thomas Wardwell, and in 1663, she was accused of wearing a silk scarf. After she married widower John Wilds in 1663, John Gold and Mary Gold Reddington, the brother and sister of John Wilds' late wife, developed a hatred of Sarah Wilds, and in 1670 began spreading rumors that she was a witch. Even after Mary Gold Reddington passed away from natural causes years later, Mary's friend continued to harass and torment Sarah Wilds. The Golds family were close friends with the Putnam family of Salem Village. Shortly after the Salem witch hunt began in March of 1692, the Putnam family accused Sarah Wilds of witchcraft in April of 1692, and she was arrested. John Wilds' daughter, from a previous marriage, and son-in-law, Sarah and Edward Bishop, were also arrested, as was John's other daughter, Phoebe Wilds. Sarah Wilds was brought to trial on June 29th and executed on July 19th, 1692. Reverend George Burroughs, age 40s. George Burroughs was the only Puritan minister to be accused and executed during the Salem witch trials. Burroughs was a minister in Casco, Maine during the 1670s, but left the settlement after it was attacked by Native Americans. He later settled in Salisbury, Massachusetts for a while before being asked to serve as the new minister in Salem Village in 1680. The residents of Salem disagreed over his appointment as minister and was not always paid his salary. He often borrowed money from the Putnam family to support his family. When he stopped being paid altogether, he left Salem and returned to Maine. At some point, the Putnam family sued Burroughs for failure to repay his debt and shortly after accused him of witchcraft. Burroughs was arrested, brought to trial on August 5th, and executed on August 19th, 1692. Martha Carrier, age 33. Martha Carrier lived in Andover and was the wife of Thomas Carrier. Carrier was also the niece of outspoken opponent of the Salem witch trials, Reverend Francis Dane of Andover, and the sister of accused witch Mary Toothaker of Billerica. Carrier was the first person in Andover accused during the Salem witch trials. She was accused by her neighbor Benjamin Abbott. After the two had a dispute over land, and Abbott immediately fell ill. Her children were also accused and were coerced into testifying against her. Carrier was brought to trial on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. John Willard, age about 30. John Willard was a deputy constable in Salem at the time of the Salem witch trials. He was one of the first people in Salem to speak out against the witch trials. Willard was responsible for helping to arrest the accused witches, but soon began to doubt so many people could be guilty of witchcraft and quit his job in protest. Shortly after, Willard himself was accused of witchcraft by Ann Putnam, Jr., who also accused him of beating her baby sister to death. Willard was not immediately arrested, but his in-laws, the Wilkins family, began to grow suspicious of him. Willard was accused a second time by his wife's grandfather, Bray Wilkins. After Wilkins fell ill upon receiving a cross look from Willard in May of 1692. Just a few days later, Bray's grandson, Daniel Wilkins, was found dead, his body bloody and beaten, and according to court records, to the best of our judgments, we cannot be but apprehend but that he died an unnatural death by some cruel hands of witchcraft or diabolical act. An arrest warrant was issued for John Willard, but he had already fled Salem village. A second arrest warrant was issued, and Willard was hunted down and arrested in Nashua, New Hampshire. During his examination at Beadle's Tavern in Salem town, the incident with Bray Wilkins and Daniel Wilkins was brought up, and the Wilkins family also accused Willard of beating his wife. Several confessed witches testified against Willard, as well as Afflicted Girl Ann Putnam, Jr., who testified that she saw many ghosts of people Willard allegedly killed. John Willard was brought to trial on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. George Jacobs Sr., age 72. George Jacobs Sr. was accused of witchcraft by several people during the Salem witch trials, including his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs. He was a reluctant churchgoer and was an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials. He was first accused by his servant, Sarah Churchill, who also accused his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs. His son, George Jacobs Jr., was accused as well, but he evaded arrest. Many people testified against George Jacobs Sr., including almost all members of the Putnam family. He was found guilty on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. Jacobs' family reportedly retrieved his body from the execution site and buried him on the family property. John Proctor, age 61. John Proctor was a wealthy farmer who lived on the outskirts of Salem village. He was an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials and often threatened to beat or whip the afflicted girls for their role in the witch trials. After his wife, Elizabeth Proctor, was arrested on charges of witchcraft in April of 1692, the afflicted girls turned on John Proctor during Elizabeth's examination and accused him as well. John Proctor's entire family was eventually arrested on charges of witchcraft. Proctor knew Salem was in the midst of the mass hysteria, wrote a letter to the Boston clergy in July asking that they intervene or move the trials to Boston. The clergy responded, but it was too late to save Proctor, who was brought to trial on August 5th and executed on August 19th, 1692. His remaining family members were either neither charged or found guilty and pardoned. Proctor's body was reportedly retrieved from the execution site and secretly buried on his farm. Alice Parker, age unknown. Alice Parker was the wife of fisherman John Parker. The couple lived in Salem town, where Alice was known as a pious, honest woman. Parker also had a reputation of clairvoyance, and on one occasion successfully predicted that a friend's husband had died at sea. In May of 1692, afflicted girl Mary Warren suddenly accused Alice Parker of witchcraft. During Parker's trial, Warren made several surprising accusations against her, claiming Parker bewitched her mother to death, made her sister ill, and drowned several men and boys in the sea, including a man named Thomas Westcott and his entire crew who drowned after the ship sank. Alice Parker was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Mary Parker, age about 40. Mary Parker was a widow from Andover. Parker was first named a witch by William Barker, Jr., and was accused of afflicting Martha Spragg. It is not known why Parker was accused, but she stated during her examination that there was another woman in Andover named Mary Parker and suggested it was a case of mistaken identity. Martha Spragg then stated that the woman in front of her was the woman who afflicted her. Mary Parker was brought to trial on September 17th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. And then there is amputator, how do you say that one? Age 70s. She was a widow who lived in Salem town, where she also worked as a nurse and midwife. She had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and often quarreled with locals. She was accused of witchcraft in May of 1692 by Sarah Churchill and several other afflicted girls of Salem village. Some of her medical supplies, such as foot ointments, were confiscated and introduced to the court as objects of the occult. During her trial, Putiator accused many of her accusers of lying. She was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Wilmot Red, age unknown. Wilmot Red lived in Marblehead and was the wife of fisherman Samuel Red. Like Bridget Bishop and many other witch trial victims, Wilmot Red had also been accused of witchcraft before in 1687. She was an unpopular person around town because she often quarreled with others and had an abrasive personality. Red's daughter was the wife of fellow accused witch Reverend George Burroughs. Red was accused of witchcraft in May of 1692 by the Salem village afflicted girls and brought to Ingersoll Tavern in Salem village for her examination. She had never met the afflicted girls before, and when asked why they were afflicted, she stated that they were in a sad condition. She was indicted, and several Marblehead residents testified against her. Red was brought to trial in September and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Margaret Scott, age 77. Margaret Scott was a widow from Raleigh. Scott had 7 children, but only 3 survived childhood. After her husband died in 1671, Scott was left destitute and forced to beg from her neighbors. This made her unpopular with her neighbors. Scott was accused by 2 of Raleigh's most notable families, the Wykehams and the Nelsons. A member of the Nelson family also sat on the grand jury that convicted her. Scott was brought to trial on September 17th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Samuel Wardwell, age 49. Samuel Wardwell was a carpenter from Andover. He was also a well-known fortune teller and practitioner of English folk magic. He is believed that his work in the occult led to his witchcraft accusations. Wardwell was accused in September of 1692 and arrested and jailed in Salem shortly after. His wife and daughters were also arrested. During his examination, he admitted to fortune-telling and dabbling in magic and said that the devil may have taken advantage of him for these reasons. He then confessed to making a pact with the devil, but later recanted his confession. Wardwell was brought to trial in mid-September and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Martha Corey, age 72. Martha Corey lived in the outskirts of Salem village and was the wife of wealthy farmer Giles Corey. Corey had a reputation for being a pious member of the community despite the well-known fact that she had a child out of wedlock in the 1670s. Martha Corey was also an outspoken critic of the Salem witch trials and stated many times that the afflicted girls were liars. During her own examination, she told the judge, "We must not believe all that these distracted children say." In March, Giles Corey testified against his wife in court, stating that she may have bewitched his farm animals and himself. When Giles Corey himself was accused of witchcraft and arrested in April, he refused to provide any information on Martha or himself. Martha Corey was brought to trial September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692, just 3 days after Giles Corey had been tortured to death for refusing to enter a plea. Mary Esty, age 58. Mary Esty was the sister of accused witches Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Cloyce. She lived in Topsfield and was considered a pious, well-respected member of the community. In April of 1692, Mary Esty was accused of witchcraft, arrested, but was then released in May. She was accused again in a few days after her release and arrested. She was examined and indicted in 2 charges of witchcraft. Esty was brought to trial on September 9th and executed on September 22nd, 1692. Now, some of them refused to enter a plea, and they ended up being tortured to death because of that. Giles Corey, age 71. Giles Corey was a wealthy farmer who lived on the outskirts of Salem village. He had a reputation for being an angry, violent man and was once charged with murdering his farmhand in 1676. He was found guilty, but only suffered a fine for his actions. Many locals, including Thomas Putnam, suspected Corey had paid a bribe for his freedom. In April of 1692, Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft after his wife, Martha Corey, had also been accused and arrested on the same charge. Giles Corey refused to enter a plea in an attempt to prevent his case from going to trial. He reportedly knew he was going to die, either in jail or on the gallows, and wanted to avoid being convicted before he did. As a result, Giles Corey was tortured for 3 days in a field on Howard Street in Salem town in an attempt to force a plea out of him. He died on the 3rd day of his torture on September 19th, 1692. Okay, then these were found guilty but pardoned. Elizabeth Proctor, brought to trial on August 5th and found guilty. She was sentenced to death, but the execution was delayed due to her pregnancy. She gave birth in January, was released from prison in May 1693. Abigail Faulkner Sr., brought to trial on September 17th and found guilty. She was sentenced to death, but the execution was delayed due to her pregnancy. She was released from prison in March 1693. Mary Post, brought to trial in January 1693 and found guilty. She was sentenced to death but pardoned by Governor Phipps. She was released from prison in March 1693. Sarah Wardwell, brought to trial in January 10th, 1693 and found guilty. She was sentenced to death but pardoned by Governor Phipps. Elizabeth Johnson Jr., brought to trial in January 1693 and found guilty. She was sentenced to death but pardoned by Governor Phipps. Dorcas Hoare, brought to trial on September 9th, 1692 and found guilty. She was sentenced to death but never executed. She was released from prison in March 1693. Then the ones that pled guilty and pardoned. Rebecca Eames confessed in August of 1692. Abigail Hobbs confessed in April of 1692.